Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a really fascinating piece of academic analysis. It looks at why the promise of diversity in law schools has, well, kind of fallen short, and more importantly, how we can actually fix it. You know, legal education shapes the minds of the folks who go on to defend our rights, write our laws, and judge our cases. But what happens when the very institutions training these legal minds don't really reflect the society they're supposed to serve? We're going to unpack some profound research today that looks way past the surface-level fixes and asks some pretty difficult systemic questions.
Okay, check out this staggering statistic from an Ontario study. There's only one Filipino lawyer for every 2,730 members of that community. Just let that ratio sink in for a second. And the thing is, this isn't just an isolated anomaly. The research highlights similar representation gaps across multiple communities. We're talking one lawyer for every 1,649 Latin Americans and one for every 994 Southeast Asians. These numbers immediately highlight a stark reality about who actually gets to practice law.
So this brings us to the million-dollar question we're unpacking today: the massive gap between the diversity legal institutions promise and the reality they actually deliver. For decades now, law schools across North America have explicitly committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So if the commitment is genuinely there, why does this massive disparity persist? Why does the legal profession still look so fundamentally different from the diverse public it serves?
To figure this out, we're grounding our explainer today in some incredibly detailed research by Faisal Bhabha, published in the Osgoode Law Journal. This paper meticulously examines the last 20 years of diversity promotion in legal education. And what's great is that rather than just pointing out the problem, the author critically evaluates the history of how law schools have tried to fix it, where those attempts hit a brick wall, and what a genuinely inclusive way of teaching the law might actually look like.
Let's kick things off with Section 1, the representation gap, demographics versus the legal profession.
To really grasp the solutions being proposed later, we first need to understand the true scale of the representation gap. Research by Michael Ornstein, which is cited in the paper, found that while visible minorities made up 23% of the Ontario population at the time of the study, non-white lawyers comprised only 11.5% of the profession. That means the percentage of minority lawyers was exactly half of their representation in the general public. Now, younger cohorts of lawyers are starting to show better representation, but the overall profession, it remains starkly misaligned with the society it operates in.
And even with the massive global rights revolution that kicked off in the mid-20th century and the lowering of formal barriers, the legal profession is still seriously lagging behind. The author makes a really interesting point here. As older, explicitly exclusionary rules faded away, the general population diversified at warp speed, and the entry of minorities into the legal profession, well, it just couldn't match that pace.
Which leads us to Section 2, First Wave Fixes, Band-Aids on a Broken System.
If we look back, we can trace a clear timeline here. We see a progression from the civil rights movements of the 1960s straight into targeted admissions policies. We see specialized classes popping up, like the very first Women in the Law course in 1972. We even get specific constitutional mandates, like the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms in '82. But despite all these milestones, this era ends with a completely sobering reality in the 2000s, an ongoing, disproportionately high dropout rate for minority law students.
Now, this is absolutely crucial. The author argues that affirmative action is basically just a tool to alter demographics, not a cure for structural exclusion. It was designed to close the representation gap quickly, which, is important, but it largely just treats the symptom. Because the traditional culture of the law school hasn't actually changed, students admitted through these programs often find themselves slapped with an at-risk label. And that leads directly to those high attrition rates we just talked about. It's like they're let into the building, but the building literally wasn't designed for them.
On top of that, law schools tried to mix up their curriculum by adding specialized outsider courses that focused on marginalized groups. But the research points out that this just creates a massive divide. Mainstream traditional law stays locked in as the core, while these diverse perspectives get shoved out to the periphery as electives. The author argues that keeping these vital viewpoints as optional add-ons does pretty much nothing to transform how legal education is universally taught.
All right, let's dig a bit deeper in Section 3, the myth of neutrality, beneath the surface of legal education.
To get why minorities still feel alienated even after getting into law school, the paper looks at the very DNA of legal reasoning. It brings up this really powerful concept from legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw called perspectivelessness. Essentially, this is the myth that the law is a totally colorblind, objective, and neutral science. By teaching law like it's math or physics, the traditional classroom completely ignores how the law actually interacts with different social groups in the real world. The research argues this is a distortion because it assumes the dominant mainstream perspective is the only objective one.
And the research shows this forced objectivity has a massive silencing effect. As scholar Rob Truesdale notes, when students are forced to strip away their own lived experiences just to participate in this so-called neutral legal analysis, minorities are arbitrarily disadvantaged. The traditional classroom ends up magnifying the voices of privileged students who already see their own lives reflected as the norm, while totally minimizing the voices of students whose lived realities contradict that norm.
So it all boils down to two different ways of looking at equality. The paper posits that traditional legal education relies way too heavily on formal equality, treating everyone exactly the same, as if we all just magically started at the exact same starting line. But that completely ignores the historical and systemic roadblocks that created the exclusion in the first place. The author argues that true diversity requires a total shift to substantive equality, which actively acknowledges and addresses those different starting lines.
Which brings us to the ultimate goal in Section 4, towards thick diversity, a pedagogy of inclusion.
If law schools actually want to stop playing whack-a-mole with the symptoms of exclusion, they need a structural overhaul. We have to move from thin diversity to thick diversity. Thin diversity is what we're used to, changing the faces in the room, taking some photos for the brochure, and managing admissions. Thick diversity, on the other hand, is a game changer. It means fundamentally rewriting the curriculum and the way classes are taught. It means baking substantive equality right into the definition of being a lawyer. It's not just about who is learning the law anymore, it's about how the law is learned.
So how on earth do we pull that off? Well, the paper points to experiential and clinical learning as the ultimate silver bullet for breaking down these historic barriers. Instead of just reading dusty old appellate cases in a vacuum, experiential learning teaches law by actually doing law. By blending hands-on, real-world practice with structured critical reflection, law schools can seamlessly integrate marginalized perspectives right into the core skills training of every single student. The author actually coins a term for this, multicultural hyper-education. And what's vital to understand here is that this isn't just an elective for a few people. It's for all students. Under this model, everyone, both white and non-white students, is actively taught how the law can either reinforce social status or be used to challenge it. It yanks diverse perspectives out of the periphery and plants them firmly in the mainstream, which ultimately creates way better, more culturally competent advocates for today's world.
This research leaves us with a really profound thought to chew on. As you think about the future of legal education, our justice system, and institutional reform as a whole, you gotta ask yourself, are we just changing the faces in the classroom to make ourselves feel better about the statistics, or are we actually willing to change the foundation of the systems that govern us? Thanks for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep asking the hard questions, and I'll catch you next time.